Right, that's brilliant. So I think I invite you all to put any more questions as we continue through the session into the chat, and there should be some time at the end where we can come back to all our panel members and see what they're thinking about your questions. I now would like to, thanks Helen, now like to bring in Mark. Mark, would you like to just quickly introduce yourself and then please do your session? Thanks.
Thanks, Anita. I'm Mark Harding. I'm the independent chairman of the Association of Play Industry. So we represent the manufacturers of playground equipment in the UK. I'm not a scientist nor an academic. And so basically I'm going to talk to you about the practical aspects of, keeping play areas open, why you should keep them open. And also perhaps give you some sort of anecdotal feedback from our members and local authorities and schools up and down the country who've been wrestling with this for quite some time. I guess to start with, one important thing is to say that, as you're all aware, there are differences across the devolved nations. But when it comes to outdoor free playgrounds, they are very similar. They are allowed to be open at the moment. We lobbied hard for that reopening to take place back in the May-June timeframe. And I'm happy to say that I do believe we were listened to. And as you know, they issued guidance that allowed playgrounds to reopen at the end of June, early July, depending on whether you're in Scotland, Wales or England. What we then did was we worked with MHCLG to try and refine that guidance to make it as practical and as workable as possible. There were some difficulties in that, given there was a lot of input to the guidance from various government departments and various people who had an interest, like Public Health England, the NHS, the MHCLG and others. And so it was quite difficult getting changes made, but we did manage, I think, in the main to get it into a reasonably practical state. I think one of the other things we did was, through our contacts elsewhere in Europe, we were able to share what other nations across Europe had done in reopening play. And I have to say, I think other nations may have prioritized it a little bit more than did UK Gov. But anyway, we got what we wanted in England by the first week in July, and the guidance was issued. Most of the local authorities, we did a survey with which the Society of Local Council Clerks did for us a week after the reopening, that informed us that over 50% of playgrounds had actually reopened, and the operators had taken whatever steps were necessary to get that done. They ran it again a month after, and we found that 70% were reopened. And anecdotally, I would say that at the minute, over 80% of play areas across the UK have reopened. There are some that have, steadfastly remained closed. And it's interesting to note that where that is taking place, you'll pretty much find the local community are kicking up a bit of a fuss about that. But the main reason that it's quoted is that either the local authority insurance company has prevented it in some way, shape or form, or they simply haven't got the funds to put the risk mitigation measures in place. So to talk about the government guidance was updated on the 12th of this month. Some of you may not even be aware that it was updated. One of my frustrations is the only way you can find out this thing is updated is to actually go on the website on a regular basis and find out. You would think that there was some method of letting you know it's updated, but there isn't. by and large, every time they've updated it, I think they've done a reasonable job of refining the language somewhat and simplifying the language. So they've done a little bit of that. But the main difference is they've recognised the 3-tier system in England. And they basically then say, when you are changing your tier from 1 to 2 to 3, it is down to you as a local operator to determine whether you want to keep that play area open or not. Now, again, anecdotally, and I've had a number of discussions over the last few days, including a discussion with MHCLG, it is not the government's intention to close playgrounds. They are leaving it for a local decision. And that local decision actually remains unchanged. The advice is, and the most important part of the government advice is, that you must carry out a risk assessment, a COVID-orientated risk assessment. Now, some local authorities, and particularly parish councils, found that particularly daunting because they may have not carried out a risk assessment before. We could argue that maybe they should have, but never mind. But they went further in the guidance, and in actual fact, if there are less than 5 workers in that particular authority, because in some parishes it may just be Bob who goes round and gives things a look every now and again, the risk assessment does not need to be a written formal risk assessment. It can be something that's done by the parish council themselves, amongst themselves. But nonetheless, a risk assessment must be done. And the outcome of that risk assessment then determines whether the play area opens and what measures are taken. Now, to give you some examples, the government guidelines give you some that are quite frankly unworkable. And let's start from the ridiculous one of, implementing a booking system. A simple risk assessment, as David would probably tell you, is, can I implement a booking system? How difficult is it going to be? And what are the impacts of that? Well, it becomes impractical to do a booking system, so you then write that off. But there are a couple of really practical things that you can do. The first is signage. Our position throughout this has been that the whole issue around reopening playgrounds and allowing children to play together has been one for personal / parental responsibility. And unfortunately, as my old nana used to say, common sense isn't at all that common. And so unfortunately, you do have to put some signage up to remind people that they must social distance and they must wash their hands and so forth. It should then be down to the parent or guardian to ensure that, they take hand sanitizer with them, or that the children's hands are being cleaned beforehand. So putting the right messages on the signage is actually just a practical thing to do. The second thing that's actually quite easy to do is to make a value judgment on the capacity of that play area or play equipment or gym equipment or whatever it is. And I've seen various approaches here. Different local authorities have taken a different stance. The most simplistic has been to look at the square meterage of the area, and assuming that there's a 2 meter space between, if it's a 4 meter square, then you can have 2 people in it. That again would come out of a risk assessment. You make that judgment and then you say that. Others have looked at the equipment, looked at a set of swings. It could be a 4-bay set of swings. They've said, well, let's exclude 2 of them and say 2 children can play on that. So again, these are real practical things that you can do. You don't have to be an expert to do this. Anybody can look at a play area and make these judgments. And those judgments are accepted as part of that risk assessment. Which brings me to the third part, which I think I did notice a question somewhere, which was around cleaning, hand sanitizing, etc. And I think I'll try and answer the question about sand pits at the same time. Obviously, within the government guidance, it talks about making sure that there's some cleaning regime in place. It doesn't say you've got to clean it after every use. It doesn't say you've got to clean it every hour. It doesn't even say you've got to clean it every month. It says an appropriate cleaning regime. And so again, that will come as part of your risk assessment. The problem with sand is, how the hell do you clean it? And so I think a lot of operators have gone through a risk assessment, said, well, you know what, we'll have somebody go once a week and give the thing a rub down, and that'll be our cleaning regime, and we'll tell people that we'll do that. We tick that box. But in all good conscience, can we honestly say we've cleaned the sand? And so a lot of operators have stepped back and decided that the sand pits will remain closed. You know, to David's point, I don't think there's any evidence that you can actually catch it from sand. However, in trying to appease insurance companies and the public, because members of the public will complain, then some local authorities have actually said to do that. Now, the other aspect of cleansing has been the provision of hand sanitizer stations. This is a tricky area, and we found very, very quickly that, of course, the original guidance was you must use an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. And that guidance also said that for the hand sanitizer to be effective, fully effective, it needed to have an alcohol content above, I believe, 90%. The yobs love this because it burns very easily. With an alcohol content in excess of 90%, the thing will go in flames very, very quickly. And so there were a lot of plastic hand sanitizer dispensers popped up around play areas in the first week and promptly melted and burned to the ground within a fortnight. Some enterprising companies have introduced IP65, which is a water resistant specification. They're still available. They'll cost a lot of money and they'll provide hand sanitizer. It's absolutely down to the local authority whether they want to go and do that. And I can't say for or against. What I can say is there should be parental or guardian responsibility to ensure that there's cleanliness in the play area. And I think that's about it. I think, you've got to take a practical approach to reopening. There's no reason why they can't remain opened. Even the councils and the areas that are going into tier 3, there is nothing in the guidance that says close them. It is down to you and your environment. We would encourage, and I've got to tell you that the API fully endorses everything that David and Helen have said about it's the societal risk versus the benefit. And as I said to somebody yesterday, if you were a child in a high-rise block of flats and your only outside space was the local playground, you don't want it to close because it's probably your only opportunity to get out and play. So yeah, I think that's about me done, Anita.
Okay, well, thanks, Mark. That was really good and really practical. And I know a lot of the questions that have come up are really practical. I've just got one question straight away, which is at the beginning of your speech, you said that there were other countries in Europe who you felt may have prioritised play a bit more than we did here. Can you tell us what some of those are? Be interesting to know.
No, I think whereas we were, we as the API were consulted at very much the last minute after a quite frenzied 2 months of lobbying every possible MP we could. I think in other countries there was a open dialogue between the industry and operators about the practical aspects, and we were able to, to build on that. We managed to get that information. I have to say, and this is not a political statement at all, and I can't remember the name. If there's somebody from Scotland on, you'll know who he is. But when you get the Scottish guy, who's the equivalent of Whitty on, he will actually say publicly that it's very important that children play and that play areas are open. I've heard him say that at least twice or thrice on national news. I haven't heard any of the UK central government advisors come out and say that.
No. Okay, so do you have any practical tips for within people's risk assessments, how they may want to talk about how they sanitize or disinfect their playground equipment? That question has come up in many different ways from many different people. Have you got any practical tips about that?
I think the main practical tips is what is practical to achieve. Okay. So if you are a large local, metropolitan local authority, and you've got a team of people who go around, empty the bins, and this sort of thing, asking them on the daily round to go around and wipe the equipment down is not a major burden and could be an outcome from your risk assessment, and you determine that actually we will do a cleansing round once a day with a COVID spray or whatever. If you are, and I'm going to the two extremes here, if you are a small parish and, Bob, who runs the local cafe, also goes every now and again and checks that everything's okay, then realistically, you're not going to be able to do it, are you? So, you come around and you determine that actually the evidence that we have from the various sources say that it doesn't survive outside. Therefore, we don't believe cleansing is necessary, nor do we have the people to do it. Therefore, our determination is we will not do it. I mean, it'd be great to get David's perspective on how that would stand up in a court. But yeah. I think the whole purpose of a risk assessment is the process of going through the risk assessment and looking at the different options and then coming up with a practical solution. That would be my advice.
Okay. And Nicola, I don't know if you'd be able to unmute our panel again, Helen and David, because I think some of the questions that are coming up now might be useful to get a range of.
Actually, there's one great question, and it's jogged my memory that John's just placed. And I think I saw a question from you yesterday, Anita, around vandalism.
Yeah.
One of the things we are seeing, and we're getting a lot of reports about, is because play areas were closed for quite some time, and some operators took some very simplistic measures at resolving matters. And John's example there's a great one, where you take one swing and you sort of tie it together so it can't be used. They're sad-looking places, those. And a sad-looking, neglected place gets abused. The yobs will tend to make a bad-looking place worse. It just happens. A well-maintained play area tends to get looked after far more than one that looks neglected. And John's dead right. One of the biggest risks we see going forward is the lack of funding and the lack of resources at a local level, combined with the fact that some of these areas have been allowed to go into a state of neglect, has actually made some of the equipment dangerous. And I think local authorities need to be aware of that when assessing the risk about COVID, don't forget the risk related to the safety and the usage of the equipment either. Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.